Chief Justice Roberts laughs at black voters, Jasmine Crockett. Silences the Supreme Court. He laughed, in the highest court of the most powerful democracy on earth, with cameras rolling and history watching. Chief Justice John Roberts tilted his head back, smirked, and laughed. It wasn't a chuckle shared in jest. It was cold, contemptuous. The kind of laugh that told millions of Americans their struggle was somehow amusing to the most powerful judge in the country. Across from him, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood still, braided hair neatly tied, a red blazer catching the light like war paint. She didn't flinch, she didn't blink, she didn't shout, because she didn't need to. This was the Supreme Court, and the highest seat in the judicial system had just mocked the very idea that voter suppression was real. Just seconds before, Crockett had delivered her opening statement, clear, concise, and backed with decades of civil rights case law. She spoke of black voters walking 17 miles to polling stations, of Hispanic citizens waiting in line 4 hours longer than their white neighbors, of entire communities being surgically carved out of democracy through closures, delays, and technicalities. She didn't scream injustice. She described it like a surgeon with a scalpel. And Roberts laughed. The sound echoed through the chamber like a gavel turned sideways. Justice Thomas leaned over, whispering something to Justice Alito. Smirks followed. The right side of the gallery murmured approval. Conservative think tankers scribbled notes with knowing smiles. On Fox News, producers were already cueing the B-roll Crockett loses control in SCOTUS. The headline probably read, "Except she didn't." Because in that moment, that exact second, Roberts chose to dismiss the lived reality of millions. Crockett saw what others missed. He'd just handed her the entire room. The gallery didn't gasp, but they froze. Justice Sotomayor stiffened. Barrett raised an eyebrow. Even Gorsuch, always stoic, shifted slightly in his seat. Not because Crockett had said anything wrong, but because Roberts had just laughed at the pain of their nation. Crockett stepped slightly to her right. It was a subtle move, barely noticeable to the untrained eye, but to the cameras, to the record, to the millions watching live, it was everything. It meant she was now perfectly framed in the shot, standing squarely in front of the Chief Justice of the United States. Her face, his smirk, her composure, his dismissal, her evidence, his entertainment. The contrast was now immortal. She raised her voice not louder, but heavier, with all due respect. "Chief Justice," she began, her voice as calm as a closing argument, "you may find the facts of voter suppression amusing, but for the 80-year-old veteran who stood in line for 5 hours and still didn't get to vote, it wasn't funny." A journalist's pen dropped in the gallery. Barrett leaned in. Ann Roberts, for the first time in a very long time, didn't smile. Crockett continued, her tone slicing through the chamber like a slow burn. "You laughed when I mentioned polling place closures in Georgia. Allow me to read the internal email your court hasn't seen obtained via FOIA just last month." She lifted the tablet from her aide. The screen projected a highlighted section onto the chamber's screen. The words were simple, chilling. "Consolidating these 5 locations into one will significantly reduce turnout in District 5, which tends to vote 70% Democratic. Budget constraints provide perfect cover." The words hovered in the air like smoke after a cannon. Roberts looked up. Justice Kagan exhaled. Outside the chamber, someone watching from a coffee shop in Detroit whispered to herself, "Oh my God." And inside that courtroom, Crockett wasn't done. She didn't attack, she didn't posture, she simply revealed. "This isn't about emotion, this is about math. In Madison County, Georgia, black voters had to travel an average of 17.1 miles to vote. White voters, 4.3. That's not democracy, that's design." Silence swallowed the court. "You called it inconvenience, Chief Justice," she said, eyes locked on Roberts. "But for those on the ground, it's injustice wearing a bureaucratic mask." By now, the right side of the gallery was dead quiet. Even Justice Alito wasn't smiling anymore. The screens shifted to a map of Arizona color-coded wait times by district. Orange and red blotches suffocated minority neighborhoods. The numbers weren't partisan. They were from state election boards. 4.5 hours in Phoenix's District 3, she said softly. 22 minutes in District 8. Same county, different neighborhoods, different skin tones. The screens dimmed, but Crockett's presence didn't. "And yet," she said, almost whispering now, "you laughed." She paused. That silence, it wasn't a break. It was a weapon. "The last time this country laughed at the idea of voter suppression," Crockett said, "we had poll taxes, literacy tests, and jelly bean jars counted by hand. We called it Jim Crow. We said it was over. She let the words hang. Then she stepped forward, placing a single affidavit on the podium. This is Mr. James Henderson, she said. He's 80 years old. He's voted in every election since 1964. Last year, his polling place closed at 6 p.m., even though dozens were still in line. Meanwhile, in the neighboring white majority district, voting continued until 7:04 on O Bisiboum Samomba. She looked at Roberts, directly. Unblinking. Chief Justice, do you believe Mr. Henderson's voice matters less because he didn't have the privilege of proximity? The room held its breath. There was no answer. And that right there was the moment Jasmine Crockett took control of the highest courtroom in America. Not by yelling, not by protesting, but by making the silence unbearable. Roberts didn't speak because what could he say in that instant? With Mr. Henderson's affidavit still resting on the podium like a folded flag, the Chief Justice of the United States found himself precisely where he never expected to be, out-argued, out-evidenced, and outmaneuvered, not by a seasoned Supreme Court litigator, but by a 42-year-old Congresswoman from Texas who refused to let silence be mistaken for surrender. And she wasn't finished. Crockett turned slightly toward the gallery, eyes sweeping the chamber, then back to the bench. This isn't a debate over election theory. This is about lived experience. This is about a veteran denied his vote after 6 decades, a grandmother who stood in line for 4 hours while holding her oxygen tank, a first-time voter who missed work and got fired. These are not stories. They are patterns. She placed a second affidavit beside the first, then a third, then a fourth, one by one, like petals falling from the same poisoned flower. They weren't props. They were people. And every one of them ignored, delayed, pushed out, had one thing in common: they were black, brown, or poor. And none of them had the benefit of being born in a zip code that made democracy feel seamless. From his seat, Roberts adjusted his posture, not because he was uncomfortable physically, but because the record was becoming something he could no longer wash his hands of. Every paper she laid down was not an accusation. It was a reckoning. Then Crockett reached for her final folder. She didn't speak immediately, just held it, and let the silence speak instead. This, she said slowly, is the Department of Justice's 97-page review of voting infrastructure changes in 3 states since 2020. It documents 226 polling location closures. 80% of those closures occurred in districts with at least 60% minority populations. None of those states submitted data to explain why. She looked at the bench, then past them, into the cameras, into the country. No legal justification, no budget memo. Just vanished. She paused, then added, and still, you laughed, by now. No one in the courtroom was taking notes. They were watching, witnessing, feeling, because Crockett had done what no procedural filing ever could. She made voter suppression not an abstraction, but a face, a veteran's face, a grandmother's breath, a young worker's pink slip, and then she pivoted. For the record, she said, I didn't come here to win an argument. She reached into her briefcase and unfolded a single-page printout. I came here to remind this court of your own words, Chief Justice. A ripple passed through the bench. She began to read, Equal justice under law requires the neutral application of legal principles. She lowered the paper. You wrote that, sir. Shelby County v. Holder, 2013. The moment hit like a dropped gavel, because now it wasn't just moral pressure. It was constitutional symmetry. Crockett had reached into Roberts' own legacy, his own legal philosophy, and turned it into a mirror. And the reflection staring back was uncomfortable, because if equal justice was the goal, then unequal access to the ballot was not just a policy concern, it was a betrayal. Across the chamber, you could feel the shift, not in the law, but in the air. The gallery didn't erupt, it contracted. The weight of the truth pulled the room inward, tighter, heavier. Even Justice Barrett, who had earlier questioned the intent of Crockett's data, now sat forward with visible intent. Her pen was down, her hands folded. She was no longer cross-examining. She was listening. Anne Crockett, she stood like she had all day unshaken. Let me be clear, she said. This is not about making voting easier. This is about making it equal. She looked at Roberts again. When access depends on race, class, or zip code that is not democracy, That is discrimination with a filing system. Justice Alito opened his mouth, but Crockett moved ahead before he could interrupt. Let me anticipate your next question, she said. You'll ask, where in the Constitution does it say polling places must be equal? She held up the 14th Amendment. Here, she said, then flipped to a second slide on the screen, a map of voter ID rejections in Texas, broken down by surname. Names like Hernandez, Garcia, and Patel were rejected at twice the rate of Smith or Johnson. She didn't offer commentary. She let the data burn. Still coincidence, she asked quietly. The question wasn't rhetorical. It was radioactive. Even Roberts seemed to sense it. His hands folded, then unfolded. He adjusted his robe. His jaw tensed. But Crockett wasn't done showing the gap between power and reality. She reached into her folder once more and pulled out something that didn't belong in a courtroom, a photograph. It was of a young woman, maybe 19, sitting on the curb outside a polling place. She had tears in her eyes. Her name, Crockett explained, was Eliana. Her ID had been flagged. Her name didn't exactly match her voter registration. She was turned away. She never voted. That was in Arizona. The district went red by 412 votes. Eliana was one of 263 whose ballots were never counted due to clerical mismatches. That's not policy, Crockett said. That's erasure. She walked back to the podium, and then something unexpected happened. Justice Thomas spoke, not loud, not with authority, but with tension. Congresswoman, even if those disparities exist, where in the Constitution does it say that voting must be? Convenient Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she delivered the line that would later go viral in campaign ads, TikTok clips, and constitutional law classrooms across the country. Chief Justice, she said, turning her body to face Roberts directly. You called these barriers a bit more effort. She lifted the map again, highlighted counties in red. 17 miles is not a bit more effort. 5 hours is not a bit more effort. 70% of closures in minority areas is not a bit more effort. Her voice dropped not out of fatigue, but gravity. That is systemic obstruction disguised as federalism. The bench sat still. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't arguing a case. She was conducting a national diagnosis. The chamber didn't applaud, but the silence sounded a lot like accountability. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick, coiled, charged with the weight of what had just been said. Systemic obstruction disguised as federalism. The phrase echoed not in volume, but in consequence. It landed not just on the ears of the justices, but in the gut of everyone watching. Crockett didn't just drop a line. She unmasked a lie that had been institutionalized for decades. Roberts didn't respond immediately. He reached for his gavel, not to strike it, but to feel something solid, something still in his control. But, at that moment, even that wooden symbol of authority seemed less certain. Because Crockett hadn't just brought facts. She brought alignment between lived experience, constitutional principle, and the very language of the court's own precedent. She was playing chess in a room full of checkers. She stepped back from the podium, just a few inches, her body never breaking posture. Then, with deliberate calm, she tapped the screen behind her again. It shifted. Slide 37, a bar chart of polling place closures by income bracket. Slide 38, time-lapse footage of lines in predominantly black precincts stretching around blocks, while neighboring white districts showed voters walking in and out within 10 minutes. Slide 39, a scanned internal memo from a Georgia election official. We've cut early voting sites in District 6, historically low Republican turnout, Dem-heavy zone, not worth the staffing cost. No speculation, no spin, just the quiet indictment of bureaucratic language used to suppress voices. Roberts adjusted in his seat again, but this time he wasn't leaning back. He was leaning forward, Crockett noticed, and seized the moment. What this court chooses to see as neutral application, she said, has become camouflage for selective exclusion. She pointed at the memo again. This isn't oversight, it's intent. Justice Gorsuch finally spoke, his voice precise but unsure. Congresswoman, these documents they've been independently verified. Crockett nodded once. All obtained through federal FOIA requests, time-stamped, chain of custody intact. DOJ authenticated them within the last 30 days. The room shifted again. This wasn't conjecture. This was evidence federal, hard, and indisputable. From the gallery, reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras didn't flash, but every movement felt like history being recorded in real time. Then, Crockett moved to the microphone once more. This court, in the past, she said, has ruled that burdens on voting must be weighed against state interest, that barriers must be justified by necessity, not convenience. She looked at Roberts again. Tell me, Chief Justice, what is the necessity of silence? He didn't answer because to answer would be to choose between legacy and integrity, and Crockett wasn't done pressing. She raised her final document for this round a leaked email thread between Arizona state lawmakers discussing which districts to consolidate in the next election cycle. Focus on 15, 21, and 33. Over 70% minority, low R turnout, mask, underfunding gaps. She didn't need to interpret it. She simply read it aloud. Then she looked at the bench. This is not partisan, she said. This is surgical. The impact rippled again. Justice Sotomayor's face hardened. Kagan looked stunned. Even Barrett's jaw clenched slightly, not in protest, but in recognition. Crockett continued, her tone lowering to something more reverent now. You call this courtroom a temple of justice. But what kind of temple demands proof of pain before it believes in suffering? The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was sacred, because she had moved past law, past politics, into something else entirely. Conscience. She walked back to the podium and picked up the affidavit from Mr. Henderson again. She held it in both hands. This man waited 5 hours to vote. You waited 5 seconds before laughing. She let the words sit. Then, for the first time, she introduced her final piece for the day, a video. It began to play without sound. A black mother sitting on a folding chair at a polling site in Texas. 2 children asleep in her lap. The timestamp read 11:36 p. Safars. The footage was from a public live stream. No editing, no commentary. Just a woman who waited 6 hours for a chance to cast her ballot. When the video cut to black, Crockett looked back to the bench and asked the question no one expected. Would you make your own wife wait there? Barrett's head tilted slightly. Sotomayor closed her eyes. Even Thomas shifted. Roberts didn't move, so Crockett clarified. This isn't hyperbole. This isn't rhetoric. This is the litmus test of empathy. And then she did what no one anticipated. She reached under the podium and pulled out a chair, an old folding chair, metal, scuffed, worn, and she placed it directly in front of the bench. I brought her chair, Crockett said. Silence. She waited. Quietly, patiently, lawfully. This chair is all she had. Reporters weren't typing now. They were frozen. The justices stared. This isn't a prop. It's her testimony. She looked at the gallery, her voice never rising. You call our arguments theatrical, but the theater is what people go through just to vote. She stepped back. The chair remained, empty, powerful, and then came the line that would make the headlines. You laughed at a story, but the country just met the witness. No one interrupted. No one dared, because Jasmine Crockett had done what few ever had. She had turned the highest court in the land into a courtroom where the people, not just the law, were finally heard. The witness had no voice, no microphone, no legal team, just a chair. And in that chair, empty as it was, sat every voter whose silence had never been considered admissible until now. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to explain it. She didn't need to shout or dramatize. The courtroom had already changed temperature. The power dynamic, invisible but undeniable, had shifted. Because what Roberts had dismissed with a laugh now stared back at him in the form of a simple metal chair and a woman who waited into the night while democracy passed her by. The justices were still watching it, and not the video. The chair. Because that chair didn't accuse anyone. It exposed everyone. Crockett stood beside it without a word, letting the quiet do what her closing arguments couldn't. Because sometimes, in court, the absence of a rebuttal is the loudest thing in the room. Then she spoke. She didn't sue. She didn't file a complaint. She just sat. She looked at the bench. And sometimes, just sitting in the wrong zip code is what gets your voice deleted from the system. Justice Roberts cleared his throat. It wasn't a rebuttal. It was an attempt to reclaim presence. Congresswoman, he said, carefully measured, you've raised deeply troubling points, but your interpretation of intent relies heavily on emotional framing. Is it not possible that these decisions, while unfortunate, stem from logistical challenges rather than deliberate discrimination? He was reaching, and Crockett knew it. Chief Justice, she answered, her voice calm but cutting. If it were logistics, the inefficiencies would be random, scattered, unpredictable. She turned to the monitor again. Slide 52, a heat map of polling place closures across Georgia, Arizona, and North Carolina, color-coded by racial demographics. It looked like a warning system, Red blotches exploded across every majority black and Latino area like brush fires. But the data shows precision, a pattern. This isn't collateral damage. This is targeted erosion. She turned back to Roberts. And I'm not the one making that claim. She clicked the next slide, a screenshot of an internal memo from the Georgia Election Strategy Group, dated just 6 weeks before the last statewide election. Minimize site consolidation in white rural districts. Focus reductions in dense urban cores lower compliance risk, higher net D loss. The memo had never been published before. Crockett didn't need to say a word. The silence in the room spoke for her. Justice Alito sat back. Justice Barrett blinked. Roberts blinked too. But Crockett wasn't done. There's more. Her legal aide handed her a binder, dark blue, unmarked. Inside, 47 pages of text message transcripts between local officials coordinating last-minute precinct changes. She read aloud, "Can we move 15 to 12? That'll bottleneck them good. If we add a school event at the site, it'll force relocation without notice. They're too obvious if we touch 14. Better to split 10 and double line times. Each line more casual, each word more damning." And then she asked, "Is that logistical?" She let it hang. Is that the chaos of underfunding or the choreography of suppression? For once. Roberts didn't respond, not because he couldn't, but because anything he said might now sound like complicity. She walked back to the podium. "I want to be clear," she said. "I'm not accusing every election official of malice, but I am holding systems accountable for their results. Because if a system consistently fails the same people in the same ways, with the same impact at some point, intent becomes irrelevant. The effect is the injustice." She paused. "And the law must protect against effect." The room didn't move. She pressed forward. "I'm not here to villainize this court, but I will remind it of its role. You don't just interpret the law, you interpret its consequences." Then she said it, a line she had rehearsed 100 times, but only now, in this exact moment, did it land like thunder. "You don't wear that robe to preserve neutrality. You wear it to protect the people neutrality forgets." Gasps rippled through the gallery. One reporter at the back whispered, "Jesus!" Another wrote in their notebook, "Mic not dropped, mic detonated," and Crockett. She didn't smile. She reached under the podium again and pulled out a sealed folder with the Department of Justice watermark. "This," she said, "is a sealed affidavit from a federal whistleblower inside the Georgia Elections Commission." She held it up without opening it. It contains emails, call logs, and meeting transcripts indicating direct political coordination with National Party operatives to reduce minority turnout in targeted districts. The room froze. You'll find references to turnout filtration and optics-controlled closures, names, dates, orders. She placed it gently on the clerk's table. "I submit it to the court for in-camera review." Roberts didn't even nod. His eyes were on the folder, and for the first time, his face no longer held doubt. It held dread. Because now, this wasn't just a confrontation, it was a crisis of legitimacy, of perception, of law. Crockett stepped back. "I don't need to convince this court of injustice. The evidence has already done that." She turned to the chair once more. "And she doesn't need to speak for her testimony to be heard." The camera angle cut wide, capturing Crockett, the justices, and the chair in a single frame. That shot would become the defining image of the confrontation. It would appear on magazine covers, in law school, PowerPoints, on murals in Atlanta, Houston, and Detroit. And in that moment, captured live, immortalized by silence, Jasmine Crockett hadn't just won an argument, she'd placed the burden of history on the Supreme Court's bench and dared them to answer it. The burden now sat not only on the bench, but in the empty chair beside it. That silent witness, whose story needed no microphone, had shifted the weight of proof. The court could no longer pretend it was deliberating an abstraction. It was now staring at the consequences of its indifference, and Jasmine Crockett stood between the law and the people it had forgotten. The chamber remained still. No one moved to dismiss. No one dared. Because whatever was in that sealed folder from the Department of Justice was now as real as the affidavit in Crockett's hand and the chair that refused to be just furniture. She let the tension breathe for a moment longer before she spoke again. Not louder, not faster, but with the cadence of someone who understood exactly what came next. "You have the evidence," she said, eyes locked on the Chief Justice. "Now, let me give you the voice behind it." She placed the last affidavit on the podium and unfolded it carefully, her hands deliberate. Her tone dropped a half note, not for drama, but for gravity. "Mr. James Henderson," she said softly, "served this country in Vietnam. He returned to Georgia in 1973, He's voted in every local, state, and federal election since then. She looked around the room, the justices, the aides, the rows of press and spectators, until 2022. She held up a printed photo, a black man, silver-haired, standing in the rain under a plastic poncho, leaning on a cane in front of a polling site. That year, new rules moved his polling place to a school building on the far edge of the district 17 miles from his home. Public transit was reduced. His license had expired, but he still tried. He waited over 5 hours to vote. Her voice cracked not from weakness, but from the weight of the story. Just before 6 p.m., the line was still 40 people deep. Officials closed the door on them. She let that line sit, let it seep into the stone of the chamber. He stood there, she continued, a man who had worn the uniform, buried friends under American flags, paid taxes for 50 years, and he was turned away from the most basic act of citizenship. She lowered the photo. I want to ask this court, was that his fault, or was it this system's design? Justice Kagan leaned forward, visibly moved. Justice Barrett's lips pressed into a line. Justice Thomas remained still. Ann Roberts, he exhaled, slowly, like someone realizing the moment was no longer just judicial, it was personal. Crockett pressed on. This court has ruled on everything from same-sex marriage to corporate personhood. But when it comes to the black voter standing in the rain, cane in hand, waiting to be heard, we get doctrine. We get deference to states. We get laughter. She looked directly at Roberts now. You laughed, sir. And maybe in your mind, it was just skepticism. Maybe it wasn't meant for us. But we heard it. And I promise you, Mr. Henderson heard it too, the gallery murmured, then quieted again. Your laugh, Crockett said, echoed louder than any argument. She paused, then turned back to her team. Bring up the last exhibit. The screen flickered, then came the video. Grainy cell phone footage. A polling station in rural Georgia. Mr. Henderson, sitting on a milk crate, his legs shaking. A volunteer draping a blanket over his shoulders. Someone in the background saying, We're closed, sir. You have to go. The video played for less than a minute. That was all it needed. The room sat in stunned silence as it faded to black. Then Crockett said, barely above a whisper, Would this be constitutional if it happened to your father? No one answered. She took a step forward. I'm not here today because I enjoy confrontation. I'm here because my community cannot survive without representation. We do not have the luxury of delay, or dismissal, or judicial distance. Our democracy doesn't just bend at the margins, it breaks. Then she delivered the closing strike of the day. You ask what the court can do. Let me offer a constitutional remedy. She walked to the screen again. Up came a simple 3-part framework labeled in bold. 1. Disparate impact review. Any voting law that disproportionately affects minority voters must undergo constitutional scrutiny. 2. Evidence of intent clause. Where internal communication or policy shows deliberate suppression, federal oversight must be triggered. 3. Equal access. Standard states must prove that all communities have comparable access in distance, time, and resources before changes are implemented. She turned back to the justices. This isn't activism, this is fidelity. To the Constitution, to the 14th Amendment, to the Voting Rights Act, which your court gutted in 2013. She looked at Roberts once more. You removed the pre-clearance protections because you said discrimination was no longer significant enough to warrant federal oversight. But we are living in the evidence you denied. Then she reached for her final card. Literally, she held up her voter registration card. This, she said, is not a souvenir. It's a promise, one that our government made to every citizen. She held it in the air, then set it gently on the chair. And when the promise fails, she said, it's not the people who have broken it, it's the institutions. Silence returned, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was loaded, weighted, alive. A beat passed, then 2. Then Roberts finally spoke, his voice steadier than before, but lacking the confidence of his earlier remarks. Congresswoman Crockett, this court acknowledges the seriousness of the evidence presented. Crockett didn't reply. She didn't need to. She stepped back from the podium, let her eyes drift across the room one last time, and sat down, her hands folded in her lap. The chair remained where she left it. And so did the story it now told. The chair stayed, long after the hearing concluded, after the cameras shut down, after the marble chamber began to empty. That folding chair, unremarkable, unadorned, but now sacred, remained, and so did the silence it commanded. Because that chair no longer belonged to one woman waiting in the rain. It had become a monument, a placeholder for every vote dismissed by distance, every voice delayed by design, and every life told it mattered only on paper. Jasmine Crockett didn't take the chair with her. She left it right there, in full view of the bench. So, when Chief Justice Roberts rose from his seat that afternoon, he didn't just rise from the bench, he rose in the presence of what he could no longer ignore, a country watching, a courtroom transformed, and a chair that now bore witness to his response. The country didn't wait for the ruling. Within hours, the footage went viral. Clips of Crockett's confrontation with Roberts, the laughter, the affidavits, the maps, the memo. The chair spread across every major platform. TikTok stitched together side-by-sides of Roberts' smirk and Crockett's solemn, surgical takedown. Instagram Reels replayed her line. You don't wear that robe to preserve neutrality. You wear it to protect the people. Neutrality forgets. Hashtag after hashtag surged jar Crockett speaks Jarm's chair of truth jar from lauder to silence. Roberts heard us. Within 48 hours, the phrase she brought the chair wasn't just a meme, it was a rally cry. At community centers in Detroit and Atlanta, volunteers began placing folding chairs beside voter registration tables. In classrooms, civics teachers printed out Crockett's 3-part standard and asked students to draft their own amendments. At Howard University, a student taped a photo of Mr. Henderson to a campus polling box and wrote in Sharpie. He waited, we won't, but the most unexpected ripple came from Capitol Hill. Jasmine Crockett returned to Washington not as a firebrand, but as a validator of the truth. Her colleagues, many of whom had underestimated her youth, her cadence, her courtroom sensibility now stood when she entered meetings. Representative Jim Clyburn reportedly told her, "You didn't just argue, you transferred power," Senator Cory Booker said in a press briefing. That wasn't just testimony, that was a mirror held up to the court, and to all of us. Even political opponents were caught on hot mics whispering. She had the receipts and the room. A few days later, in an unusual move, President Biden invited her to the White House for a private debrief. The photo of them standing in the Oval Office, her, in the same red blazer, him holding the DOJ folder, became front-page news. But it wasn't the media coverage that mattered most. It was the quiet changes. In Arizona, election officials postponed their next round of polling location consolidations. In Georgia, a new legislative subcommittee was formed to review the closures highlighted in Crockett's presentation. In Texas, where Crockett had started her legal career defending disenfranchised voters, a surge of young volunteers flooded voter outreach programs. One grandmother in Houston was overheard telling her teenage granddaughter, "Baby, that woman made the judges sit down and listen. Now it's our turn." Even within the Supreme Court, whispers emerged from clerks and aides that Justice Barrett had requested a private review of every closure memo cited in the hearing. Justice Kagan began drafting a legal note about disparate impact standards not for opinion, but for potential future application. And Chief Justice Roberts, he returned to the bench 2 days later, noticeably more subdued. In a separate case, he interrupted a lawyer mid-argument not to challenge, but to clarify. Please explain how this regulation impacts access, not merely policy. We're now keenly aware that access is not always equal. It wasn't an apology, but it was an echo. And echoes have power. Weeks passed, then months. Finally, the court issued its opinion on the voting rights case. It was not the sweeping rebuke that activists had hoped for, but it wasn't the dismissal many feared either. The majority opinion, authored by Roberts himself, acknowledged the existence of documented and troubling disparities in voter access. While the court declined to fully invalidate the contested state laws, it ruled that any future changes with disparate demographic impact must be subject to a heightened standard of scrutiny. It wasn't revolution, but it was recognition. And in the concurring opinion, Justice Sotomayor cited Crockett by name. She wrote, "Congresswoman Crockett reminded this court and the country that silence does not equal absence, and laughter does not erase harm. The evidence she presented and the truths it exposed demand not only review, but reckoning." Jasmine didn't release a press statement. She didn't hold a victory rally. Instead, she returned to her district in Texas to the very communities who had trusted her to speak where they couldn't. At a local voting rights rally held under a scorched sun, she stepped onto a makeshift stage. No teleprompter, no entourage, just the same red blazer and a copy of the Constitution tucked under her arm. She looked out at the crowd seniors, students, veterans, mothers, skeptics, believers, and she said, "I didn't go to the Supreme Court to make headlines. I went because too many people can't afford to wait in the rain anymore. I went because some of us don't get to vote quietly. We have to vote through noise, through distance, through disbelief. She paused. And if it took a chair to make them see that, then I'd bring 1,000 more. Cheers erupted, and in that moment on that small stage in a crowded park, democracy didn't feel abstract. It felt close. It felt like Crockett. Back in Washington, law professors began rewriting case studies. In classrooms from Berkeley to Boston, students debated not just the legal merit of Crockett's argument, but the emotional genius of her delivery. And somewhere in Georgia, Mr. Henderson watched from home. He smiled, because his story, his weight had finally been heard. And because the woman in red had not just brought the truth. She had made the court sit with it and left a chair behind so they'd never forget.